good night to those drinking coffee, to the night owls, to those tuning in to the frequency at this late hour. We appreciate you. Not like you to imagine something. A man wakes up tomorrow morning. He works from home, orders his lunch through an app, he streams his entertainment, pays his bills online, orders groceries for pickup, has his dinner delivered to his front door. By the time he goes to sleep, this man has his every need met. And he may not have spoke a single word to another human being. Is it because he's antisocial or because he's hiding? No, just because he doesn't have to. Now, 20 years ago, this would have sounded unusual. In today's time, it's becoming increasingly more common. And before we go any further, I would clear something up about that. I use or have used some of these services myself, not DoorDash, mind you. Seems kind of unsettling to me for some reason. But you've probably used them as well. And, this is not a rant about technology, it's just a question about consequences. Because every tool changes the way we live, sometimes in ways we don't notice until many years later. Because there was a time when daily life forced us into contact with other people. The grocery store, restaurants, fast food, a diner, the bank, local newspaper, if you're of that age. Most of those interactions lasted less than a minute. Many were completely forgettable. But together they formed something larger, a community. You recognize faces. People recognized you. You belong to a place. Today, we're building a world designed to remove friction. And to be fair, so far it's pretty effective. Need groceries? Click a button. Need dinner? Open an app. Need a movie? Shit, it's already waiting for you. Need to avoid other people entirely? Yeah, modern life can accommodate that for the most part. And that's where things can be a little interesting. Consider the delivery economy: DoorDash, Uber Eats, Walmart Delivery, Amazon. Individually, they're pretty remarkable services. Collectively, however, they raise an uncomfortable question. If loneliness is rising, if people increasingly report feeling disconnected, if communities feel weaker than they once did, then why are humans so enthusiastically embracing technology specifically designed to eliminate everyday interaction with other humans? That's not a criticism, it's just pointing out a contradiction, I think. One worth thinking about. Perhaps the problem isn't the technology. Perhaps the problem is that we've started viewing every interaction as an obstacle. The cashier is an obstacle. Who the hell wants to talk to them, right? Even if it's 20 seconds. The line is an obstacle. The neighbor is just an interruption. You got better shit to do. The trip into town is inefficient now. But what if those inconveniences were performing a function? What if they were quietly holding communities together? There's a pattern emerging beneath all of this. Every generation invents tools that save time. Ours may be the first generation inventing tools that systematically remove other people from daily life. One change seems insignificant: a self-checkout, a delivery app, a canceled trip to town, a closed diner, a disappearing gathering place. No single change transforms society. 1,000 small changes might, though, and seems to be. Because communities are rarely built through efficiency. They're built through repetition, the human experience. The familiar waitress who remembers your order, the clerk who asks how your family's doing, the neighbor you're going to wave at about every time you're outside, the old man sitting outside the feed store. Just tiny interactions, small moments, things that seem meaningless until they're gone. And perhaps that's going to be the stranger part of this segment. We've never had more ways to connect, yet many people feel increasingly disconnected. We've never had more information, yet many people feel increasingly isolated. Maybe those two things aren't exactly unrelated. Maybe that's the signal worth paying attention to tonight. Not whether convenience is good or bad. That's extremely simple. The real question is what we're trading in exchange for it. Because every civilization is built on trade-offs. And ours may be trading community for convenience, one delivery at a time. Welcome back. I'd like you to think about the town you grew up in, not the highway, not the big stores like Walmart, Kroger, Kmart, any of that, but Main Street, the local family owned restaurant, the hardware store, the pharmacy, the bookstore, the places where people didn't just shop, but they met. There was a time when nearly every American town had a Main Street, a place where business was conducted, news was exchanged, and neighbors crossed paths. You didn't just visit Main Street because you needed something. You visited because sooner or later everyone ended up there. And that's what made it so important, those little interactions. Across much of the country, locally owned businesses have struggled against changing consumer habits, online retailers, and national chains. Many downtown districts have seen storefronts close. Now, some have adapted, others have not. Yet communities that invest in their main streets often discover something important. People still want places to gather. People still want local identity. People still want a sense of belonging. And that's where things become very, very important, I think, moving forward, especially in this generation. Main Street wasn't built around efficiency. It was built around proximity. The people who owned the businesses lived in town. The customers lived in town. The money stayed in town. And perhaps most importantly, the relationships stayed in town. Main Street was never just a place to spend money. It was a place to spend time. The barber knew your name, or beautician. The waitress remembered your order. The owner of the hardware store knew what project you were working on before you even reached the counter. Those relationships were very important. And it's not because they were very dramatic. They weren't. They were the opposite. They were just ordinary. Ordinary interactions are what communities are built on. A conversation here, a familiar face there. A shared space where people feel connected to something larger than themselves. The challenge facing Main Street isn't simply economic. It's cultural. When a local business closes, another business may eventually replace it. But when an entire downtown loses its purpose, a town loses something harder to measure. It loses part of its identity. It loses a gathering place. It loses a reason for people to leave their homes and encounter one another. And after discussing community for sale earlier, that feels particularly important because if modern convenience is reducing interaction, and if Main Street is also disappearing, then we're losing both the habit of community and the places that make community possible. That's a pattern. That's something to look at. Fortunately, this story doesn't have to end with a decline, because across the country, many communities are revitalizing downtown districts, restoring historic buildings, supporting local businesses, creating events that bring people back together. They're proving something many people already suspected. Main Street is not obsolete. It simply needs people who still believe it matters. And that's what I want you to focus on from this segment. Not whether Main Street can survive, because it can. I've seen it in the town that I live in now. The question is whether we still understand what it was for. Because a community isn't measured by the number of buildings it has. It is measured by the number of reasons people have to leave their front porch and see one another. And Main Street remains one of those reasons. All right, for our final segment, we're going to jump into an old fairy tale. I'm sure everybody's heard of the Pied Piper in some way or another. So, for this last segment, we're going to go back more than 700 years to a small town in Germany called Hamelin. And most people know the story: the rats, the flute, the colorful clothing, the fairy tale. But the oldest versions of this story were never really about rats, they were about children. And children don't usually vanish from history without leaving questions behind. According to local accounts, something happened in Hamelin on June 26, 1284. A mysterious man arrived in town dressed in bright clothing. He offered to get rid of the community's rat infestation. Well, the townspeople agreed and paid him for his service. Using a pipe or a flute, he allegedly led the rats away from the town. The problem began when the townspeople refused to pay what they promised, and some stories it's the townspeople, some stories it's the mayor. So the stranger returned, and this time, according to legend, he played a different tune. But it wasn't rats following him out, it was the children. 130 of them. They walked out of Hamelin, and they never returned. Now, here's where it's interesting. The oldest references to this event focus almost entirely on the disappearances of the children, not the rats. Not revenge, not magic, just the disappearance. In fact, many historians believe the rat portion of the story may have been added centuries later, which leaves us with a very strange possibility. What if the original mystery was real? So here's what we know. Records from Hamelin dating back centuries reference a loss of children in the year 1284. The event became so important to the town's identity that it was reportedly memorialized in local records and stained glass windows. Yet nobody can say with certainty what happened. Some historians believe the children may have been part of a migration movement, which sounds completely ridiculous, but okay. Others suggest disease, famine, recruitment efforts, religious movements, or some forgotten historical tragedy. And, those are theories, and there are possibilities there. There are no definitive answers, however. And I think that's why this has survived. It's because communities remember trauma, especially when the trauma is never fully explained. Think about what that would have meant. A town waking up one morning and realizing an entire generation had just vanished. The future of the community simply gone. No explanations, no closure, only stories. As the years passed, those stories grew. A stranger became a piper, a tragedy became a legend, and a historical mystery became one of Europe's most enduring folk tales. But underneath the folklore remains a question. What happened in Hamelin? Who or what was the stranger? Why were so many children connected to a single event? And why did the people who live closest to it feel compelled to preserve the memory for centuries? Perhaps because they understood something we forgot. Communities are fragile. A town can survive hardship, it can survive poverty, it can even survive disaster. But when it loses its children, it loses its future. And after discussing our first segment, our segment on Main Street, this feels like a fitting end. Because every story we've discussed has been about communities. Communities growing weaker, communities losing gathering places, communities changing. And in Hamelin, according to legend, a community lost something far more precious: its next generation. And that's just something to think on. More than 700 years later, people still remember the rats. But the real mystery was never the rats, it was the kids. Because nobody can tell with any certainty where they went. And I guess that's probably why the story just refuses to die. The tragedy and the loss of youth.